whoever creates the narrative pretty much controls the downline of that narrative. And that's the most important thing that Schwab contributes to the whole WEF crowd. He creates the narrative. And so he wrote this book called The Great Narrative. And especially when COVID hit, he put out the propaganda line that this basically is paraphrased. This represents a unique opportunity to call for a great reset, that this is necessary now with COVID has happened and the world is all upside down, and we need a great reset to reset the economic system altogether. Well, of course, that's what the global crowd has been calling for decades, but he made it sound like a brand new idea. And so he wrote he wrote a book called The Great Reset too, but then he wrote a book called The Great Narrative. And so when people meet in Davos, they hear elements of the great narrative. Now, the people that attend Davos were not the ones that created the great narrative that Schwab wrote about. I traced the history on this, by the way. All of the contributors were named in the front of the book. I went and did a research project on all of them to see where they're from, what kind of industry they were in, and blah, blah, blah. And I found out that the vast majority, like 80% of the contributions to the great narrative, came from academic institutions in the United States, not from Europe, not from any country in the South, not from South America, not from Africa. It came from academic organizations within the United States, and very elite ones at that. So you have essentially a foreign narrative that's been created on how the world is going to look in 10 to 15 years, with steps on how to get there. And this is the narrative that is promoted at the World Economic Forum. There's never another alternative narrative. There's never any plan B whatsoever. It's always this one that's presented. So how would you expect, I suppose, any of those companies to act when they get drilled with this new great narrative? They're going to say, well, that sounds good to me. If that's where the money is, that's where I'm going to be. And that's what I want to do. And so they run off after the great narrative. I'm sure some of them don't even question it. They think, oh, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. And, can't wait to do it. Can't wait to fulfill that. Others might be skeptical, and they might say to themselves, I'm skeptical, but I want to get rich. So I'm going to follow the great narrative. Either way, whoever controls the narrative controls everything that's within that narrative, as time moves forward. This is exactly what's happening here.
Now, talk to us a little bit about the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders program, the YGL. What is it? Who's graduated from that program? What do these people go on to do as alumni of this program?
Well, yes, the Young Leaders program was a stroke of genius on Schwab's part, I'm sure, to bring young people to the table, to indoctrinate them with the great narrative. That's essentially back to the great narrative again. This is where you get indoctrinated. It doesn't matter what your education or skill level is, or what your skill set, or what position you might hold in government. But the Young Leaders program is basically, I hesitate to use the word brainwashing, sort of, but they're talked about incessantly about what this future is going to be, that they've created. The young leaders are not invited to create the future. In other words, to have discussions about what the future should look like. No, that's left up to Klaus Schwab and his high-level cronies. But once they have determined, well, this is the way the world's going to go, then they're going to bring these young people in, and they're going to put them in at the table or on the table, whatever, to pound this into their head that this is where it's going, and you need to participate. You need to follow along with it and do the things that are appropriate that will get us down the road. So when they go back to society, whether they ever become something or not, some don't, by the way. There's been, I think, 3,000 or more than 3,000 graduates of the Young Leaders program over time. Some of them amounted to absolutely nothing. They just went home, and maybe they became, started a business or something. They never really got involved in global affairs, but others did. And for instance, half of the people, the top level people right now in the Canadian government happen to be young, graduates of the Young Leaders program. And it's not like a university exactly. It is not like becoming a Rhodes Scholar either, by the way. It's not that high level. And it's not really educative. It's more, conditioning of the people to think a certain way and, to realize that they need to play along with the game as they move forward. And there have been lots of people that have been surprising, that have been on the Young Leaders list. The list is public, by the way. Not really sure who got it, but I received a copy of it. There's about 31 or 32, maybe 3,200 people on the list. And I looked through, actually, I read through the whole list. I was compelled. It took me a while to get through it. It probably gave me a headache too. But I looked at the whole list, and there was a few names on it that were pretty surprising. I don't have any in my mind right this second, but some people that you kind of wouldn't expect maybe would have done that, but they did. And they're all over the world. It's not just in one place, it's all over the world. Now, the Young Leaders Program, it's interesting to say here, this is a training school. This was important to somebody like Henry Kissinger way back when, and even over the decades, this has been an important issue. How do you train leaders to go into government to do the things that the Great Reset wants them to do, that will facilitate this new international economic order? The United Nations has also picked up on this because they do a lot of training too, of course. They take people in and work them over really good somehow to get the UN ideas in their brain. But the World Economic Forum and the United Nations work hand in hand. They're very closely aligned, and it's all over the World Economic Forum's website as well as the United Nations website. They're virtually one and the same, like two peas in the same pod, as far as operational concerns go.
Is it fair to characterize Klaus Schwab as an unelected world leader?
As an unelected leader, no. Personally, I would not. He is an academic, however, like Henry Kissinger was an academic. And normally, the power structure is not run by academics. More often than not, it's run by the international banking community. That would be the central banks and probably some commercial banks as well. You got some really giant banks around the world, like the JP Morgan Chase, like Citigroup, like Wells Fargo, like Deutsche Bank, Bank of England, so on. But the power structure seems to be where the money flows. That was Rockefeller's role in 1973. He was the chairman at that time of Chase Manhattan Bank, which later became JP Morgan Chase. And Chase Manhattan was the third largest bank in the world. Well, it didn't mean exactly that David Rockefeller ran the world, because he didn't. He wasn't acting like a political leader. But it shows that the influence of the narrative, the influence of on the other people that came in, who would be more interested in creating a new international economic order than a banker, a money person? That makes sense, because money is the blood of the economic system. So over the decades, we've seen this banking institution flux a little bit, where some banks would kind of maybe drop out, others would come in. But today, interestingly enough, the power structure in the Trilateral Commission especially has shifted from what we would view as commercial banks to central banks. And there's not very many central banks in the world. There's one for every country, but one central bank like our Federal Reserve does not serve other countries. It just serves us or our government. But every central bank in the world right now, for instance, is working on creating a central bank digital currency. Now, that'll put the economy on its head for sure. And you have at the top of that pyramid, if you will, the Bank for International Settlements in Basil, Switzerland. They are the ones that are, well, that's the central bank to central banks around the world. They pretty much set the policy and the tone for all the other central banks in the world. This more likely is where you see the power coming from. In other words, who orders the narrative? Where does the narrative, the research for the great narrative come from? If you look at Klaus Schwab's book called The Great Narrative, you'll see that, I don't know, 80% or 90% of the people that contributed to the book were academics. Well, academics don't act independently. They don't just one day stand up and say, I'm going to write a paper about the World Bank or something like that. No, that's not the way it works. They work for pay. They work for hire. And the money that flows to educational or academic institutions to create studies that support globalization, they're all funded by somebody. The question is who? Because the funders are the ones that pick the topics, if you understand what I'm saying. They could pick exactly what they want. Write a paper about this, justify this policy, whatever, with some type of, do some academic magic on it so it looks good to everyone that this is what we have to do. So the academic class, if you will, that section, that layer of globalization, the academic class actually doesn't have any power at all. Do they have influence? Yes. Is Klaus Schwab an influencer? Absolutely. But is he really a substantive controller? I dare say no, he's not.